Blog Talk Radio.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Laurie Smith on Blog Talk Radio. Good morning. It is 7 o'clock here in the morning, Calgary, Alberta time, Wednesday, August the 11th. This is One Child Abuse Survivor to Another. It's a 30-minute live internet streaming radio broadcast from blogtalkradio.com, and the chat room is open if anybody's awake and would like to go and sit in there. Where I want to continue talking about codependency and narcissism, and we didn't get to narcissism yesterday, but I think we're going to finish up this topic on codependency and then switch over to narcissism for the rest of the week and how they interrelate and whatnot. It's very interesting for me, as I didn't know a whole lot about it myself, but I'd heard people over the years, like I said, talking about codependency and saying that some of my family members were codependent and narcissistic and whatnot, and I thought I knew what it was, and as I've been studying and doing these shows and looking at the information, I'm starting to see that I really didn't know exactly what it was. So it's very good to look at this information, especially if we've grown up around in dysfunctional families or around a lot of alcoholics or substance abusers, right? There's a lot of codependent behaviors that go along with all of that. So so many people probably have gone through some of this stuff, right? So I thought we'd just continue taking a look at it. I might have a guest on here this morning. I think there's a lady who might be phoning in, and if so, we'll be sure and try to check the switchboard and let you in, so just in case you happen to show up here this morning. And so, I'm glad to be able to be here and do these shows. I'm not a professional counselor. I don't hold any counseling certificates or therapist certificates at all. I'm just a private citizen who pays to do my own blog talk shows, and I just think it's important that people know this. I'm a survivor myself, right? So I'm always looking for information just to sort of see what some of my behaviors are. I used to do a lot of self-sabotaging and didn't even recognize it. So as I study this out, I see some of these behaviors and I can relate to some of them. I don't relate to all of them for sure, but I just wanted to be one more voice out there for other survivors of child abuse, because I'm telling you, like I said yesterday morning, we deserve so much better. We just don't deserve to be suffering as adults. You know what I mean? We suffered as children. So how long are we going to suffer? That was my question 3 years ago, on the couch when I was sitting there. I talk about this quite a bit because that was a turning point in my life, And I thought, why do I have to continue suffering this way? And I was thinking about, sort of suicidal thoughts, and I thought, do I have to live this way in this pain, for the rest of my life? And as I was sitting there on the couch, I started to think, why am I still suffering? Why can I not heal and move on from this? And I realized, I thought, man, I got to start fighting to live and fighting to have a good life and fighting to heal and move forward and not fighting to die, because I had always been thinking that I just shouldn't be here and, this life was just, horrible, and I just didn't was never going to be out of this pain, right? And 3 years later, I'm so happy to be able to say I'm so glad I made the decision to stick around, and I hope that you will too. And if you're listening to this and you're suffering, make sure that you reach out and, don't suffer in silence. Don't suffer on your own. That's what I did for cognitively over 30 years, and it's very sad, right? We don't deserve to be suffering like that. Nobody does. Whether you're someone who's been through a domestic violence situation, domestic abuse, sexual assault, you name it. We didn't deserve that, and we don't deserve that. No one does, right? So just make sure you reach out and get some help. Get a counselor, get a therapist. Call a crisis line, call a friend. Don't suffer on your own in silence and sadness. That's a very sad place to be. And I know, there's so many of us survivors. That's the problem. And that's why I wanted to be one more voice, So, yeah, and also for survivors, you have to listen to my show at your discretion, because it could trigger you. You have to know where you're at in your healing journey, and if you're just not feeling strong enough, to listen to the information, just turn the show off, because you can always listen another time, and the archives will be here hopefully for a long time, and you can always pick up the show another time on the archive when you're feeling stronger and better, right? We don't want anybody to be triggered. And young people under the age of 18, I just ask that you have permission to listen to my show. Ask an adult or someone who's older who can listen to the show with you to see if it's something that you should be listening to. I don't know where the Blog Talk players are nowadays. They could be placed on different websites, and I don't know how young the people are listening to my shows. So I just ask that you have someone older, an adult, or someone you trust, that really is trustworthy, to listen to the show with you, and they can help you if you have questions or you're just not sure what I'm talking about or what the information is about, and just to see if it's something that you should be listening to. There's a lot of adult content on my shows, and so I would appreciate that. You'd be doing yourself a favor and myself a favor. So we're going to get right into this article, and this is where we left off yesterday. Codependency and recovery from codependent relationships. This is from www.allaboutcounseling.com/codependency.htm. And I was talking about, kind of went rambling on about the fact that it's not, that in families, there's these general rules set up within families that may cause codependency. This is what they said here. And it may include, they listed a whole bunch of stuff. It's not okay to talk about our problems. Feelings should not be expressed openly. Keep feelings to yourself. Communication is best if indirect. One person acts as a messenger between two others, known in therapy as triangulation. Another one is be strong, good, right, and perfect. Another one is make us proud beyond realistic expectations. These are family rules that families will, parents will set up, and a generational kind of thing that can cause codependent behaviors, I guess. Don't be selfish. Do as I say, not as I do. It's not okay to play or be playful. Don't rock the boat. And it says many families have one or more of these rules in place within the family, and these kinds of rules can constrict and strain the free and healthy development of people's self-esteem and coping. As a result, children can develop non-helpful behavioral characteristics, problem-solving techniques, and reactions to situations in adult life. So I just think it's interesting. We left off talking about, because I grew up in a completely dysfunctional home, and my family's still dysfunctional today, so there was no change there. It's very sad. It's so sad that my family did not get help, and that's why I'm doing these shows. That's exactly why I'm doing these shows, because we do need to get help. I wish that my mom would have got help, for her abuse. She was abused as a child, and I really wish that she would have got some counseling and therapy. She needed it, and instead of passing it on to us and taking her anger out on us because of her horrible life, she passed the cycle on to us. And my dad, same thing. He was very psychologically mistreated, I believe. I don't know. I don't think there might have been too much physical abuse. There was some. Someone broke his eardrum. There was problems, you know what I mean? But I think his was maybe a lot of psychological damage, and there might have been some sexual abuse in there. I don't know. My dad will not talk too much about it. He only talks about the good. Like, he makes his life out that it was so great and stuff. But that's because he's borderline schizophrenic, right? So who knows what reality is with him? I don't know what really happened, but his family definitely seems to be a bit strange on his side. And I love my aunts and uncles. Don't get me wrong. But they are a little bit strange, and they don't talk about anything that's realistic. Like, they don't talk about the real stuff. They only talk about things that are not too deep. I think that they don't want to acknowledge something that happened in their past, and so I think there's something wrong with what happened in their, with my grandparents and whatnot. But my mom, she used to tell me all the time about what had happened, in her home and with her mother, and she loved her dad very much. My grandfather, I guess, was a good man, but he married a woman that was just, turned out to be a monster, and my grandmother was just absolutely probably the most abusive person that I can think of on the planet, besides Hitler or something. This woman was horrible, and she was a bad woman. And so my mom used to talk a lot about her. So I wish my parents would have got help, right? They suffered from their childhoods, and then they took it into a marriage as codependent people. I can see how that happened. They were both looking for somebody to help them to solve their problems, and that they could feel that they could be needed, and it turned out that neither one of them had the coping skills, or, they couldn't get it together because the two of them were suffering, on their own, with their own issues. They should have had counseling, and then they should have had marriage counseling, and they could have grown together, and we would have seen that. And then the abuse would have hopefully stopped, and then we would have had a good family, right? That's why I'm doing these shows. It's so important that people get help and not pass these cycles on to their children, not pass this stuff on to people without even realizing what we're doing, right? So we left off with it's not okay to talk about problems, and I did talk a lot about that because so many families are like that. It's like, oh, we're not talking about that. What we don't talk about doesn't exist, right? If we pretend it's not happening, we can shove it under the carpet, and we don't have to deal with it. And so many families are like that. So many people are like that. And we have to talk about it. If we don't talk about it, it will never change. It will never be fixed. It will never get better, and if we don't talk about stopping child abuse, it will never stop, right? We have to stop this, and we have to talk about it, right? It has to be mainstream. But in families, if we don't talk about our problems, I did talk a lot about this yesterday, that our family just did not, we were not allowed to talk about things, right? And there was always something crazy going on in our home, and we weren't allowed to talk about it because my mom would basically shut everything down. She didn't want to hear it. She didn't want to deal with it. She didn't want to talk about it. My dad was just unavailable, always unavailable. Even if he was in the room, he was unavailable unless he was abusing somebody. So he was just off in his own little world, you know what I mean? Unless he was violent or trying to hurt himself or kill himself, right? So that's the thing, very dysfunctional, and we have to learn how to move past this stuff, right? How to change these things. The next one was feelings should not be expressed openly. Keeping feelings to yourself, and this is a big one, I think, for people who have been abused, abuse of any kind. Whether it's child abuse, domestic violence, sexual assault. Many times we keep our feelings to ourselves because we know that it's a hard thing to deal with, this type of stuff, right? And most people don't want to hear it. I mean, I've lost friends over this. Telling certain people, about my past would just push them off. They didn't want to hear about it. They did not want to know about it. So then, of course, because that happened, I would sort of think, well, maybe I just shouldn't tell anybody about this stuff. Even though they would ask questions about my childhood, if I tell them the truth, it pushes them away. But if I lie and say, oh, it was great, had a lovely time, and my mom used to bake cookies, and it was wonderful. If I just do that, then of course they want to be friends. But the minute I start talking about the dysfunction and whatnot that was going on in our home, they're like, oh, okay, no, bye-bye. Quite often I lose friends over this. Because people don't want to hear about abuse. Even if they were abused, they don't want to hear about abuse, right? And, we'll never solve it that way. Sticking our heads in the sand, locking it all up in the closet and locking the door, putting a lock on it, will not solve it. It will not change it. And for survivors, that's just, we have to reach out and get help on our own terms. I believe, 3 years ago I was ready to decide to get off the couch and stop sitting around thinking I should end my life, And that was on my own terms. I came to terms with that, and I think everybody has to kind of move forward on your journey at your own pace. And I've seen that just way too much in websites recently that talk about that, that we need to get help, but we need to do it at our own pace. So we need to kind of be very much in charge, in control of our journey, our healing journey, right? So, but feelings this is something that we grow up hearing, that we shouldn't be, we should keep our feelings to ourselves, right? And it's hard. It's very hard when you're brought up to be that way, and then as an adult, you have a hard time expressing your feelings, right? Because you're told as a child not to be, you can't express your feelings. Like I wasn't allowed to, like if my parents, like for instance, if I saw my parents fighting, and all of a sudden dishes were starting to crash around the room, and my mom would get shoved into the table, and then pretty soon she'd pick up something and smash my dad in the head with it, and then my dad would be smacking her, and brothers would come and try to get to her aid, and it was just absolutely insane, right? Then if I said anything about that, like, that upset me or that bothered me, then I'd be in trouble for expressing my feelings. And my mom would be like, that's just too bad, and, you have to deal with this, and she basically put it on me as if it was like my fault because I was not strong enough to be okay with it. And I mean, that's a horrible way to treat a child. I didn't like what I was seeing in my home, and didn't like the abuse, and didn't like the violence, and it was scary. You know what I mean? Like very scary. So to a young child like that, witnessing so much violence, it's very hard on a person. So I had a lot of sort of anxiety problems and a lot of nervous tension. I was always uptight, always nervous at school and whatnot. And if I said anything about it, my mom would quite often just slap me around, so and tell me to shut my mouth, right? So I was told to keep all this to myself and keep my feelings to myself. My mom didn't care how I felt about this stuff, She didn't care that I was hurting or that she was hurting me, right? So even as an older, a teenager and whatnot, I'd sometimes just to try to let her know how I was feeling about the whole thing. I might say something, and that would bring on a beating, right? She would, either with her fists or she'd pick up something and beat me with it, right? She was just very vicious, and she just didn't want to hear it. She didn't care how anybody was feeling. She just cared about herself, right? Communication is best if indirect. One person acts as messenger between two others, known in therapy as triangulation, and that's interesting. I've seen some of that. Between my parents, sometimes they would do that. They'd be like, well, you have to go tell your father this. And my mom would be like, well, you have to go tell your mother this and stuff. And I think it's because they were trying to avoid being in the same room, because actually it was just better if they weren't in the same room together. That's how we grew up. I spent years like that, because if my parents ended up in the same room together for more than 5 minutes, there'd be a fight, right? So we never ate together as a family. Once in a while, we would go to people's homes. My sister would invite us. My oldest sister, who had moved out, would invite us for dinner. We were allowed to go over there, she would say, but we were not allowed to argue. So we weren't allowed to talk about certain things. We weren't allowed to talk about religion, politics, personal stuff. We could only talk about the weather and coffee and what we were having for dessert and that kind of stuff, because my sister was very much a control freak because of she grew up in the same home I did, right? So, my parents we used to go out. They would behave themselves for a while at other people's homes, but the minute they got back in the car, my dad would be driving us home, the fight would be on, and then later when I started driving and I would be driving them over there, the fight would be on in the car, and I'd be like, if you guys don't straighten up, I'm going to turn the car back around, or I'll just drop you off right here and you can walk the rest of the way. They were completely miserable people, and so it was better for them to not be in the same room together, you know what I mean? So they would quite often do that whole communication indirectly type thing. The next one is be strong, good, right, and perfect. That was not something that I grew up with. I know a lot of people, I actually had friends whose parents were expecting them to be perfect, and they had to have A+ grades all the way through. They were not allowed to have like a B or a C on their report card. They were made to feel really bad if they had a less than like an A-, right? I actually knew kids that grew up like that, and they were supposed to be just perfect children, and everything was just supposed to be great with them, and they were not allowed to be, feel like kind of weak or that they needed help or anything like that. I actually knew kids like that growing up, especially in high school. I had met quite a few teenagers and whatnot whose parents were like that, expected really high expectations. And my parents just didn't have any expectations for us at all. They didn't care. Like, they were just like, okay, you guys are losers and all of our kids are no good and you're just going to end up on the streets and you're just going to be losers for the rest of your life. Like, we were not expected to even survive. So we didn't have that type of thing, but I know I grew up with people like that, and the stress must have been extremely hard for them to have a parent who's looking at you that, if you're not perfect, then you're just not worth it. You're just not worth anything, right? I can imagine how hard that would be for somebody. I try to put myself in their shoes to think about a parent who would be so strict on that stuff. And, if you didn't measure up, you'd never measure up, right? And that's just bad. That's also very, very destructive and very, very damaging to a person, right? Just having to be perfect all the time and so good and so perfect and so strong, right? That's horrible, Like, our parents were the opposite. They just didn't even expect us to be able to live and weren't expecting anybody to succeed. So we were the opposite of that, right? Make us proud beyond realistic expectations. And see, that's another one that goes along with that, just really unrealistic, right? Instead of accepting their children for who they are, loving them for exactly who they are right at that moment and saying, you know what, I want the best for you. You're my child. I love you. I want the best for you. But if you're doing your best, that's all I want for you. That if you're doing your best and you can actually honestly say that you're doing your best, then that is good enough for me. If it's good enough for you, it's good enough for me. And accept their children, right? Now, my mom was kind of like that. She had her moments, right? Like, I graduated from high school. Some of her children did not. But she wanted me to graduate, and she's like, I want you to graduate. You need to graduate. You're my last child, and you need, out of all the kids, there's only a couple that graduated, and I want you to go to school and do a good job, do the best you can, and graduate. So that's about the only thing that she actually did sort of encourage me to do out of, a whole lifetime of living, with her and under her realm. That was one thing that she did say that she was hoping that I would do. But that was not unrealistic. That was just standard. You hope your kids would graduate. But, she let my brothers drop out of school, let them do drugs around the house, let them behave horribly because, she was trying to kind of use them to get back at my dad, so they were allowed to do whatever they wanted. And because my dad didn't like that, so it would cause a big rift between them, and of course who would pay the price? My brothers would get their butts kicked, you know what I mean? Because my dad would be kicking their ass, then my mom would be mad because my dad was picking on my brothers, and then she would be like, their behavior's just fine with me. They can sit around here and they're doing their drugs or whatever they're doing, and they don't have to go to school. They can wear their hair long. So my mom used my brothers to get back at my dad, and my brothers paid the price for that because my dad was very abusive toward them. And so, my parents were very, very bizarre, very strange people. Don't be selfish. That's the next one. Don't be selfish. That's interesting. I don't know if I relate too much to that. I didn't seem to grow up with anybody said, my mom was sometimes saying that to me. And actually one time, I detail it in the book, she had, I was having an argument with my nephews outside, and I came in the house and slammed the door 3 times, telling them to stay out of my room because they were actually driving me absolutely crazy. And they grew up with my sister. My sister was their mother, my nephews, and my sister did not, she did the best she could, but she was not the greatest, most loving mother, you know what I mean? So she was always slapping them around and making them feel like they were such bad kids that they needed their butts kicked all the time. So their dad was always having to get the belt out and beat on them and slap them around, and he always had them up against the wall. Now this is something, now I'm telling this and I don't care, truth is truth. My nephews are just a little bit younger than me because my sister was having her children when my mom had me. So, she moved out of the house and was married, but because there's 18 years between me and her, so it's a long story. But anyway, my nephews had been over at the house and driving me absolutely crazy in the backyard. I didn't want them coming, following me into my room, which I knew they would do. So I slammed the door and I was like, stay out, stay out, stay out. So my mom ended up slapping the crap out of me and, very viciously and violently beat the crap out of me, and then beat me up with a belt right after that. And I detail it pretty detailed in the book because I can remember everything about it. But I remember she was calling me selfish because I wouldn't let them come in my room, and I'm thinking, here she is beating me with this belt, and she had just practically broke my nose and knocked my head off, and calling me selfish, right? And I was thinking, what is selfish in this? You know what I mean? I just didn't want them to invade my personal space, which was my bedroom, and which they were always doing because my nephews were allowed to do whatever they wanted because my mom felt sorry for my nephews. So when my nephews would come over, I'd quite often get a beating. But when my sister would show up and my nephews would be acting up, they would get a beating. So my nephews and myself were quite often being, made to straighten up. I guess that's what their words for it were, that we needed to be, straightened up, right? So we'd be, accosted, assaulted, right? So this is the whole thing. It was just very sick and stupid. But, I didn't see anything selfish with that. I just didn't want my nephews following me in my room and invading my privacy, which they were always doing. And, here's my mom calling me selfish. Well, my sister used to say that my mom was a very selfish person. So, but I don't know. I was never told to don't be selfish. We didn't have anything to actually give anyway, so it wasn't like we had to, share what we didn't have anything to really share. You know what I mean? We were very, very much under the poverty line. You know what I mean? So, I don't know. I don't relate too much of that don't be selfish thing. But my mom was always quite often saying, oh, don't be selfish, right? And, but I don't know. I think that's kind of normal. Parents will say that to their children. Do as I say, not as I do. That's a big one. And I think that most parents do that. And I think it's just natural. I think parents don't think very clearly about what they're doing first, and then they ask their children not to do it, and they don't realize that they're actually doing it. So, when your parents say, oh, don't behave a certain way, and then they're actually behaving that way, they're not really thinking about their own behavior. I think that's kind of can be somewhat normal for parents. Parents aren't perfect, and no parent is perfect, and no child is perfect, right? I mean, people do and say stupid things to their children, right? But the thing is when it's something like what I like to talk about as far as survivor issues, is the fact that my whole life I took a big long look at my behavior and the way I was behaving. For years and years, I've sort of looked at why I behaved a certain way when I was young, and I was very violent when I was young, and I would fly off the handle. When I got older and bigger and stronger, I could actually lift like 200 pounds over my shoulders. You know what I mean? I was very, very strong. I did that on purpose because it was a safety mechanism for me. I was trying to protect myself, and I thought, well, okay, I've just been abused by my parents. I refuse to be abused by anybody else. And so if anybody wants to take me on, they can. And I mean, I was just like a young person, and I could already lift like 160, 200 pounds, and I did that on purpose to protect myself, right? I wanted to be able to do that. So because I was so strong, I would quite often go around, and people were a little afraid of me, and because of my psychotic attitude, because I was always high, I was doing angel dust at the age of 12, doing a lot of hallucinogenics and whatnot, and different things like that. I was always kind of, acting and behaving kind of psychotically, right? And people were a little bit afraid of me, and I think, because of that, I used to push my weight around, and I was almost the bully for a while, right? I was quite often trying to stand up for people too, my friends and whatnot. But if someone did something to me that I didn't like, I would slap them, or I would chase them down and beat them up, right? I had no problem with that, but that's because that's what I learned at home. My mom, whenever I was doing something she didn't like, she would chase me down and beat me up. And so I was just following her behavior, right? So then that's what I'm saying, that whole do as I say, not as I do. So then my mom, when she found out if I had hit somebody and then their parents told my mom, then I'd be beaten for that. My mom would be like, you don't have to, you're such a bad kid, look at the behavior, look at what you're doing. And I'd be like, I'm just doing what you're doing, you know what I mean? So it was absolutely ridiculous, I mean, even young kids, when I was really quite young, I used to push kids down. Little kids would come up to give me a hug, and I would just push them, shove them down to the ground, and just walk right by, because that's what my mom was doing to me, So this is what that whole thing, do as I say, not as I do, It's like, then, parents say, well, I wonder why my child is acting this way. Well, okay, the apple really never falls that far from the tree. So if your children are acting, behaving a certain way, it's because they're seeing that behavior and they're mimicking it, mirroring it. You got to take a good, long, hard look at yourself before you start accusing your children of something, and see if it's not something that you've taught them to do, right? Because that's what children learn from their parents. They're little sponges, and they will pick up everything. So, my parents were violent. I was violent. My parents were destructive. I was destructive. I would go with my little friends at the age of 10 years old into restaurants, and we would trash the restaurants. We would trash the school. At one time, I actually did trash the classroom at school and got in big trouble for that, and got the paddle and everything at school. And then I went home and got a beating, and, it was bad. And this is the thing. I was just doing what my parents showed me how to do. My nephews were very destructive as children because their mother and father were very destructive people, too. I'm sorry to say it, but that's the truth. I don't include my nephews in a lot of my stuff, but their behavior, I may as well just be honest. Truth is truth. They were very much always doing something kind of crazy. You know what I mean? And their home life wasn't the greatest. I think they had a better home life than we did, for sure, but than I did. But they still, there was some problems there. You know what I mean? And their parents were, never take responsibility for their behaviors. It was always the boys. Look how the boys are behaving. Well, look how you're behaving. You know what I mean? And look how, and I have to think, well, who was their mother? My sister grew up in the same home I did, right? So that's the thing. They always, there's people in the family that, they love my mom. They love their grandparents, right? So they're like, well, this can't be right. These were our grandparents. We love our grandparents. It's like, well, think about your own mom's behaviors. And then think about who she grew up with. My mom. My mom was her mom. So, you got to, people just don't want to take a look at it because it's very, very painful, right? And we have about a minute left. And so the next one is, it's not okay to play or be playful. And that one I didn't have a problem with. We were allowed to play. And we didn't have a whole lot of toys, but we were allowed to go outside and play and run around in the backyard. Now, sometimes if we did something that we weren't supposed to, obviously we'd be in trouble, but then, of course, we probably deserved what was coming to us, because me and my sister would quite often destroy the backyard, and we would, dig, 6 feet holes into the ground, and we would, take down fireplaces out in the backyard, like these, stone fireplace things, and, we were just destructive. Well, so was everybody else in our family, right? But we were allowed to go out and play and whatnot. So we have about a minute left. I'll go ahead and end this here now. But we'll look at narcissism tomorrow morning. I would like to finish this up here this week. And thanks everybody for tuning in. I really appreciate you listening to the shows and being here for me. If you need something, get a hold of me. I'm on Blog Talk Radio, Facebook, and whatnot. later on this evening. And I hope you have a great day. Just make sure you do reach out and get some help. And, you know, even if it's just a crisis line, if you don't really feel comfortable talking to somebody, call a crisis line, right? You don't want to be suffering on your own. And if you're feeling really down, you need to talk to somebody. And I know I was so glad I started to reach out, and that's why I just keep saying this on every show, because all these hands came reaching back to me. So I would wish that for everybody, right? So take care of yourselves and have a great day, and we'll be talking to you real soon. Bye-bye.